Tonight, we uncover a story so subtle, so concealed, that the Vatican didn't just observe the American Revolution from afar, it guided it. Correspondence not meant for public eyes, sealed with crimson wax, hints at an unseen hand tracing the birth of a nation. Decisions whispered through cloistered corridors, letters folded in convents, and maps drawn by Jesuit hands all suggest a quiet influence that history forgot to mention. But following it is never simple. Those who trace the trail encounter locked archives, forgotten manuscripts, and a silence so complete it seems to swallow entire decades. And those who drew too close? Their contributions are buried beneath official histories, their names lost between signatures of generals and diplomats. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. They say there was a network so discreet, so powerful, that the Vatican didn't just stay neutral. It nudged, guided, and sometimes protected the revolutionaries in ways textbooks will never tell. Letters survive in attics, marginalia hint at financiers signing with saints' names, and convent ledgers record cargoes that were never meant to be seen. Documents suggest that the clergy watched over battles, whispered through salons, and counseled diplomats in a careful choreography of faith, politics, and prudence. No one fully knows who orchestrated these moves. Some credit bishops quietly shaping allegiances. Others believe Jesuit scholars displaced across Europe carried knowledge, maps, and introductions that rippled across the Atlantic. What is certain is that after independence, most traces were hidden, minimized, or rewritten. Entire correspondences were filed away under misleading labels. Records that once documented networks of support vanish like smoke in a candlelit room, yet fragments remain. A note from Benjamin Franklin hints at secret meetings in Parisian convents. Marginalia in Lafayette's letters point to financiers who signed with symbols, not surnames. And hidden in church archives, there are hints of shipments, oaths, and alliances that helped sustain a fledgling republic. Could the Vatican have truly influenced the birth of the United States without a single soldier crossing the ocean? Or is that exactly what we are supposed to believe, that religion and revolution never touched each other? Tonight, let us begin not with the familiar story of muskets and constitutions, but with the hidden threads of counsel, faith, and discretion that history tried to erase. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions are not only fought with armies, but guided by letters, prayers, and silence. And if this network truly existed, then its quiet legacy may be the most enduring influence of all. We open a door that was never meant to be unlocked. In a quiet attic above the streets of Paris, a box was found sealed with red wax, its emblem pressed by a ring that once belonged to a man of the cloth. Inside, a pouch of brittle parchment and a folded letter dated 1776. The wax carried a mark no one expected, the crest of the Vatican. What was a papal seal doing on a letter written during the birth of America, a revolution led by men who wanted nothing to do with kings or crowns? The answer, it seems, lies not in the battles we remember, but in the whispers we were never told. The Vatican was watching, not from afar, but from within. As gunpowder flared and quills signed independence, there were eyes behind cathedral walls, taking notes on the fall of an empire and the rise of a new one. The courier who carried that letter was never named, only described in a faded registry as a man of learning and silence. The message he held wasn't written in Latin or French, but in code, a cipher of numbers and symbols that historians still struggle to decode. One phrase, however, stands clear: the dawn moves west. What did that mean to the men who sent it? Why would Rome care about 13 colonies breaking away from a Protestant king? The church had seen empires rise and crumble, but this one was different. This one was built on an idea that men could be free without divine permission. For a church that had shaped Europe for centuries, that idea was not just dangerous, it was revolutionary. But here's where it gets strange. Among the papers in that pouch were not only reports from France, but sketches of American ports, notes about Jesuit missions, and lists of names that would soon appear in the signatures of history. It was as if the Vatican knew the revolution would succeed before it even began. Some say the Church saw opportunity, where others saw rebellion. A chance to regain influence in a land where religion had no throne. Others whisper that it wasn't about power at all, but prophecy. The letter spoke of a new light kindled in the West, destined to challenge both empire and altar. Those words echo like a warning or a blessing, maybe both. Imagine the candlelight flickering across the parchment, the hand that sealed it trembling between faith and fear. Outside, Paris buzzed with revolution of its own, and somewhere beneath the Vatican's marble halls, someone was already planning what would come after. A nation of freedom watched by a city of faith. A silent partnership hidden in plain sight. The courier's pouch may have gathered dust, but the wax remains unbroken, its symbol intact. A seal in red wax, holding a question that still burns. Was the Vatican merely a witness to America's birth? Or was it a midwife guiding it from the shadows? Long before the first musket fired at Lexington, before anyone shouted for liberty or independence, someone had already drawn the lines. Maps. Strange maps. They whispered of rivers not yet named, and borders not yet fought over. At first glance, they looked like ordinary charts, the kind used by sailors and explorers. But look closer, and you find something unsettling. Paths that lead nowhere, coastlines traced with mathematical precision that no explorer of the time could have known. At the bottom corner of one, a faint emblem, the mark of the Jesuits. A cross inside a Sunday. These weren't maps made for navigation, they were maps made for watching. The Jesuits had always been more than priests. They were mathematicians, astronomers, linguists, and spies. They mapped the world, not for conquest, but for control of souls and systems. Wherever empire went, they went too, quietly sketching the geography of faith and power. Some of their charts from the 1600s already showed parts of the New World with shocking accuracy, as if the Church had known exactly where trade, wealth, and revolution would one day collide. Scholars later found routes marked in red ink, connecting colonial ports with European cities known for papal banking interests. Boston, Philadelphia, Havana, Lisbon, Rome. It was not trade they were tracking, but influence. A web of commerce and confession. Every new colony was a spark, and the Vatican was tracing where the fire might spread. What made these maps even more mysterious were the annotations in Latin, marginal notes describing people and movements centuries before they existed. One fragment reads, "The sons of liberty will rise by the waters." Another, "The empire divided shall find its faith renewed across the sea." Historians debate whether these were predictions or coded instructions. Either way, they suggest the Vatican's interest in the New World was not spiritual curiosity, but preparation. By the mid-1700s, the Jesuit order had been officially suppressed by royal decree, accused of hoarding secrets and manipulating empires. Yet their work did not vanish. Copies of their maps were found decades later in the archives of French traders, and even among the personal effects of certain American founders. The question is, how? Who gave them access to maps made by men supposedly erased from history? Some say Franklin himself studied them during his time in France, learning how to read the invisible politics written into coastlines and currents. A quiet exchange between science and secrecy. When you look at those old charts now, their ink faded and edges torn, you can almost feel them breathe. They are not still, they hum with intent. Every curve, every river, every port seems to speak, a whisper from the past, saying the New World was never new. It was already known, already measured, already marked. The revolution may have been fought with muskets and ideals, but beneath it all was a map drawn by men who believed that to chart a land was to claim its future. And perhaps, somewhere deep beneath the Vatican, the original of that map still waits, a quiet reminder that history is not discovered, it is designed. In the summer of 1773, the world's most educated men were suddenly homeless. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, had been erased by decree, one order from the Pope, and thousands of priests, teachers, and scientists scattered overnight. Their schools were seized, their libraries locked, their symbols banned. It was the end of an empire of knowledge that stretched from the jungles of South America to the royal courts of Europe, or so it seemed. But the Jesuits had always known how to survive in silence. They vanished from the records, but not from the world. Some went east, blending into universities under false names. Others crossed the Atlantic, disguised as merchants, artists, even carpenters. What they carried was not gold or relics, but notebooks, filled with coded equations, maps of trade routes, and secret correspondences between bishops and bankers. In those pages were ideas that could shake kingdoms. The Jesuits believed knowledge was a weapon sharper than any sword, and though the Church had stripped them of power, it could not strip them of memory. Rumours spread that some of the expelled Jesuits had found sanctuary in the colonies, slipping quietly into the new world that was just beginning to rise. In coffeehouses and salons, men whispered of scholars with European accents, who spoke of liberty and reason, but prayed in secret Latin. No one knew where they came from, only that their eyes carried both faith and fire. A few of these mysterious men began to appear in circles close to revolution, advising printers on how to spread messages without detection, teaching navigation to sailors who would later carry supplies for the Continental Army, even helping translate foreign letters that spoke of hidden funding and moral support from unnamed benefactors in Rome and Paris. They never sought credit. They preferred to stay in the shadows, moving like ghosts between continents. In Europe, the expelled order still moved unseen. Jesuit-trained diplomats served in courts across Spain, France and Portugal, whispering that perhaps this American experiment could weaken the Protestant powers and restore a spiritual balance lost to centuries of division. The irony was thick. The very priests condemned by Rome were now working, directly or indirectly, to shape a rebellion that might one day become useful to Rome. Their networks remained alive through secret correspondence systems, letters disguised as sermons, and books with false covers. Each message carried a small mark, a cross barely visible in the corner of the page, a sign that the Society of Jesus still breathed. And if the Vatican disowned them publicly, it watched them privately, for even the Church knew their influence could not be erased so easily. They were no longer priests of empire, they were architects of ideas, builders of bridges between faith and revolution. And though history would forget their names, the shape of the world they helped design would not forget them. The Jesuit question was never whether they vanished, it was whether they ever truly left. In the winter of 1777, Benjamin Franklin arrived in Paris, dressed not as a statesman but as a philosopher, his hair unpowdered, his coat plain, his charm unshakable. To the French, he was the face of the new world, the man who dared to challenge kings with nothing but ink and ideas. But behind the laughter, the banquets, and the theatre applause, there was another Franklin, a quiet one, the one who met by candlelight in libraries, observatories, and even convent corridors. He knew that diplomacy was not fought on battlefields, but in whispers over wine. France was full of power brokers and spies, but it was also full of priests. And some of those priests had friends in Rome. Franklin had a reputation for being a man of science. Yet science and faith often crossed paths in the same hallways. He had studied the stars since youth, and it was through astronomy that he found his way to the cloisters. The Church had always held its own astronomers, men who measured heaven for the sake of calendars and prophecies. Franklin spoke their language. He could discuss orbits and eclipses as easily as he could discuss politics. One evening, he was seen entering a convent near Versailles, under the pretense of examining an old telescope said to belong to a Jesuit astronomer. What he discussed inside has never been recorded, but witnesses remembered that when he left, he carried a sealed envelope and wore a look that was more cautious than curious. Some believed he was seeking the church's neutrality in the coming war. Others thought he was securing something deeper, quiet approval from men who understood that history was shifting beneath their feet. In private dinners with abbots and scholars, Franklin used his greatest gift, a conversation. He would start with science and end with philosophy, asking questions that blurred the line between reason and belief. Could liberty exist without divine order? Could truth survive without authority? His charm disarmed, his wit disarmed more. He never attacked the church, but he never submitted to it either. He invited its thinkers to imagine a world where knowledge was free and faith was a personal flame, not a crown's command. That was dangerous talk in 1777, yet the priests listened. They saw in Franklin something familiar, a man of light. The printing press became his weapon, the same tool that once spread scripture, now spreading rebellion. With the help of sympathetic French printers, some with Jesuit ties, Franklin flooded Europe with pamphlets, describing America not as a rebellion, but as a rebirth. Freedom framed as moral duty, reason framed as divine destiny. And in quiet corners of Paris, those pamphlets passed from monks to nobles to spies. The Vatican watched from afar, uncertain whether this man was an enemy or an omen. Franklin was never officially blessed by Rome, but perhaps he didn't need to be. He had already learned how to move through faith's corridors without bowing, and how to make the church believe that in helping him, they were helping themselves. In the heat of revolution, when religion and politics were as dangerous as gunpowder, one family stood in the middle of both, the Carrolls of Maryland. They were Catholics in a Protestant world, patriots in a time when loyalty was everything, and believers in a church that had long been treated as foreign. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, signed his name boldly on the Declaration of Independence, the only Catholic to do so. That single signature was more than a gesture of defiance. It was a risk to his life and his faith. His cousin, John Carroll, a Jesuit priest, chose a different path. While Charles wielded ink and influence, John wielded words and caution. He saw what his cousin dared not admit, that freedom might break chains, but also threaten faith if handled without care. Between them, a steady stream of letters passed, written in polite phrases but charged with quiet tension. They spoke of liberty and loyalty, of Rome's watchful eyes and America's uncertain soul. John had seen the power of the church's suspicion. He knew that Rome did not easily bless revolutions. Yet he also knew that silence was no longer an option. Their letters hinted at a plan, a choreography of belief and strategy. Charles would stand in the light of politics, while John would move through the shadows of faith, reassuring both Rome and the colonies that Catholic loyalty did not belong to a king but to conscience. It was a delicate balance. One wrong word could brand them traitors to crown or creed. In Maryland, the Carrolls had already lived through persecution. Laws once banned Catholics from holding office, owning arms, even practicing their religion openly. Now, with the revolution rising, they saw a chance to rewrite those laws, not only for themselves, but for all who were told their faith made them unfit to be free. John Carroll began working quietly with Protestant leaders, assuring them that Catholic citizens would be faithful to the new republic. He preached prudence, patience, and peace, even while British troops marched and towns burned. His goal was not only to win independence, but to prove that faith and freedom could coexist without fear. When the war ended, John would go on to become the first bishop of the United States, a symbol of reconciliation between old Rome and the new republic. Charles's signature gave Catholics a place in the nation's founding, and John's diplomacy gave them a future within it. Together they proved that liberty did not have to mean rebellion against belief, and belief did not have to mean obedience to tyranny. The Vatican, though cautious, took note. Perhaps these carols were showing the world a new kind of Catholicism, one born not in palaces or cathedrals, but in a country daring to believe that truth could belong to everyone. In the spring of 1779, the Marquis de Lafayette sat in his study, surrounded by maps and half-burned candles. The young French noble, barely in his 20s, had already become a symbol of two worlds. To America, he was the dashing foreign ally who risked everything for liberty. To France, he was the restless dreamer who defied his king for an ideal that had no flag. But hidden beneath the speeches and uniforms was something far more complex, a trail of letters written in careful code, where the margins carried secrets that even his closest friends never saw. Lafayette was not only a soldier, he was a mathematician of war. His letters were filled with lines and numbers, not random scribbles but precise geometry. To most, they looked like tactical sketches, but historians who later examined them noticed strange annotations, initials that were not military at all but religious. The names of saints appeared where troop movements should have been, and every saint corresponded to a region or a bank. Saint Francis for Paris, Saint Anne for Lyon, Saint Michael for Rome. It was as if his letters were part prayer, part financial map. When traced together, they formed a network of hidden sponsors, moving money and supplies through channels that could not be tracked by kings or spies. Some of these financiers used no family names, only symbols. A star, a dove, a fish. They donated under the guise of charity, yet the sums were vast enough to fund ships, weapons, and armies. Lafayette often thanked them with blessings instead of receipts. He called them his silent companions. Many of these companions were rumoured to be connected to Jesuit circles, remnants of scholars and priests scattered after the order's suppression 6 years earlier. They had lost their monasteries, but not their influence. Through trade, publishing, and education, they still moved ideas and resources across borders. Lafayette understood this invisible current and learned to ride it. His letters to General Washington spoke openly of honour and freedom, but his private correspondence spoke of our benefactors in the faith. What faith he meant, no one could say for certain. Some believed he referred to Catholic patrons who saw the American struggle as a chance to weaken Britain. Others whispered that Lafayette was helping preserve a sacred network older than any government, one that measured human progress not in borders, but in enlightenment. In one letter, discovered centuries later, he wrote, "Gold must move as spirit does, unseen but guiding." Perhaps he meant faith, perhaps he meant money. In either case, both were flowing in the same direction, toward a revolution that needed both courage and coin. When Lafayette returned to France, his letters were locked away, many destroyed, but the few that survived tell the same story. Every saint's name led to a port. Every port to a shipment. Every shipment to freedom. The Marquis might have worn the uniform of a soldier, but his true weapon was understanding that revolutions were not only fought with swords, but with secrets written between the lines. By the winter of 1778, the continental currency was collapsing. Paper money that once promised freedom was now worth less than the ink that stained it. Soldiers went unpaid, farmers refused worthless notes, and the dream of independence trembled under the weight of debt. But somewhere in the silence between the ringing of church bells and the scratching of quills, a strange kind of salvation began to form. It did not come from generals or politicians. It came from bankers who prayed as they counted. They were never named in public ledgers, yet their influence reached from Philadelphia to Paris and even to Rome. Some were merchants with faith, others priests with ledgers. Together they created what history barely mentions, a hidden network of credit that kept the revolution alive when every treasury was empty. They called their gatherings circles of faith, but in truth they were meetings of money and mercy. Beads clicked as they prayed for victory, and afterward those same fingers turned pages of account books filled with secret donations and coded loans. The rosary had become a calculator. The Church, though cautious, could not look away. Through quiet intermediaries, funds moved from old European banks, some with Vatican ties, into colonial hands. Each transaction cloaked as trade, each benefactor disguised by devotion. One shipment might be listed as church ornaments, another as parchment, but inside, the crates were silver, uniforms, and supplies. The priests who approved these dealings did so not for politics, but for preservation. They believed the cause of liberty, if guided by virtue, might one day become an ally of faith. In Europe, where crowns ruled the conscience, the idea of a nation born free of monarchy fascinated them. If such a nation survived, it might prove that moral order did not need royal command. That was worth an investment. Within secret ledgers discovered decades later, scribes found names replaced by Latin titles. Sanctus Thomas, Maria Consolata, Dominus Fidei. Each name corresponded to amounts that matched war expenditures. Whether these were individuals or societies remains unknown, but the pattern was unmistakable. Faith had become the shadow banker of the revolution. Even Benjamin Franklin, in a letter from Paris, hinted at these invisible allies. He wrote of friends who give without name, who lend without bond, who ask only that truth prevail. When the war dragged on and the Continental Congress begged for more funding, money appeared just in time, as if answered by prayer. After victory, the circle dissolved quietly. No monuments, no memorials. Only rumours of a few wealthy men retiring to monasteries and others vanishing into foreign ports. But the echo of their work remained. The revolution had not only been fought with muskets and courage, but with trust, faith, and the belief that even money could serve a higher calling. The rosary, once a symbol of devotion, had become a bridge between heaven and economy, its beads no longer counting sins, but debts paid in the name of freedom. In the marble heart of Rome, where sunlight filters through painted ceilings and time moves at the pace of incense, Pope Pius VI paced his chamber. It was the year 1778, and the world beyond the Vatican walls was trembling. Monarchs were falling ill with doubt, colonies were breaking away, and the whispers of revolution had begun to echo even in the language of priests. To condemn rebellion was the duty of the Church. To ignore the future was its danger. Pius stood at the centre of that contradiction, caught like the pendulum of a clock swinging between conscience and survival. Every message from America carried the scent of uncertainty. Reports spoke of men invoking divine providence without blessing, of leaders quoting scripture but bowing to no pope. Freedom was spreading, but faith seemed to slip through its fingers. The Pope read those reports at his desk, a single candle flickering beside letters from Paris and Madrid. He knew the revolution was not just political, it was spiritual. A rebellion against the old order that had crowned kings by divine right for centuries. And yet, hidden beneath the chaos, he sensed an opportunity. If this new world rejected the tyranny of thrones, perhaps it could still embrace the wisdom of altars. So Pius did what Rome had always done best. He watched, he waited, he whispered. Officially, he condemned rebellion. In private, his diplomats were instructed to keep the doors open. Letters were sent to bishops in France and Spain, advising caution but curiosity. Envoys in Paris were told to observe Franklin and Lafayette, to note their manners, their allies, their words about God and governance. The Church had survived empires by mastering the art of patience, and Pius would not let a distant war catch him unprepared. Each night, as bells tolled across the Tiber, he read reports about the colonies. Their leaders spoke of liberty, but not of chaos. They sought virtue, not vengeance. It was a language Rome understood, a faint echo of natural law, the same principles the Church had taught long before kings twisted them into chains. Perhaps, he thought, this American experiment might one day need a moral compass. and who better to provide it than the shepherd of souls? But he could not act too soon. To side openly with rebels would invite wrath from Europe's crowns, all of whom demanded loyalty to the old order. To reject them outright might lose the souls of millions, so he chose the narrow path. Neither for nor against. Condemn with words, but bless with silence. The pendulum kept swinging. By the time victory came to America, Pius had aged into caution itself. His advisors called him slow, but he knew better. The Church did not move with the tides of history. It waited for the tide to turn back. And somewhere in that slow, deliberate rhythm, he understood that the revolution might not have been against God at all, but against the misuse of his name. In the frozen winter of 1775, the dream of taking Quebec died in a storm of snow and gunfire. The American army, thin and starving, had marched north, hoping to bring French Canada into the revolution. They believed the Catholic settlers there would rise against the British and join the cause of liberty. But the mountains were cruel, the cold unrelenting, and faith proved harder to win than any fort. When the cannons fell silent, more soldiers had perished from frost and hunger than from bullets. Yet the battle for Quebec did not end on the battlefield. It continued in the churches. Hidden in the pages of parish records and military memos, a quieter conflict unfolded, one fought with sermons and confessions instead of swords. Priests preached caution from pulpits, warning their flocks against the promises of rebellion. They spoke not of politics but of obedience, reminding their people that loyalty to order was loyalty to God. For many Canadians, their words carried more power than any general's command. But not all priests spoke the same message. Some, especially those with Jesuit training, chose silence or subtle defiance. They saw in the American cause something that echoed the old struggle for conscience and truth, a chance to reclaim the moral independence their order had once defended. A few even sheltered rebel scouts, offering food and secrecy beneath the guise of charity. These were the shadows in Quebec, men of faith caught between loyalty and conviction, their decisions written not in treaties, but in sermons that changed the hearts of small parishes one at a time. General Benedict Arnold's reports mention villages where priests seemed to know too much, warning of troop movements and supply lines before any spy could have told them. The British suspected pulpits had become signal towers, where coded blessings and altered prayers carried hidden messages. Even communion rites were rumoured to be used for communication. A wafer placed to the left instead of the right meant danger. A blessing cut short meant the enemy was near. Historians often dismiss these claims as legend, but fragments of church logs from that winter tell another story. Entire congregations vanished into the countryside days before raids occurred, as if warned by unseen messengers. Whether guided by faith or foresight, the line between the sacred and the strategic blurred until they became one. When the Americans retreated, leaving behind the frozen dead, the priests buried them alongside their own parishioners, marking their graves only with initials and prayers. To the Church, all souls were equal in death. To the Revolution, those graves were a lesson. They had tried to win Canada with words of freedom, but faith was not so easily persuaded. In Quebec, the war revealed that power lay not just in muskets or banners, but in the quiet authority of the cross. The failed invasion became a reminder that revolutions may march with armies, but they live or die by the sermons that reach the people first. Long before muskets fired at Lexington, Jesuit explorers had already mapped the veins of a continent. From the swamps of Louisiana to the icy rivers of Quebec, their mission journals traced every bend, crossing, and village. These were not ordinary maps. They were atlases of knowledge, filled with symbols only their order could read. And when war came to the colonies, those forgotten maps began to reappear, carried by hands that knew their value. Soldiers thought they were fighting on unknown ground, but the land had been studied for over a century by men in cassocks instead of uniforms. The Jesuit Atlas, as it was later called, was whispered about among merchants, spies, and generals. It was said to show not only geography but alliances, winter routes, and native nations who had once welcomed or resisted the missions. For commanders trying to move armies through wilderness and snow, that knowledge was worth more than gold. After the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, thousands of documents were seized or scattered. Some vanished into libraries in Spain and France. Others went underground, traded like relics among those who understood their power. By the time the revolution began, pieces of that atlas had resurfaced in strange places. A French trader in Montreal carried a fragment showing river fords unknown to British scouts. A colonial surveyor in Virginia owned a Jesuit globe marked with faint lines that traced hidden mountain passes. Even Benjamin Franklin, during his stay in Paris, was rumored to have seen one of these maps and recognized its value immediately. The Jesuits had not only drawn roads, they had mapped relationships. They knew which tribes were friendly, which valleys held food through winter, and where the old French forts had once stood beneath the trees. Their missions had been schools as much as sanctuaries, and each one had kept meticulous records. Those records became the secret blueprints of a war fought across forests no European general could understand. The British tried to confiscate the maps wherever they appeared, calling them dangerous and heretical. But copies multiplied. Smugglers sold them to anyone willing to pay, and whispers spread that a complete Jesuit atlas still existed, hidden in Rome or perhaps in a monastery in Spain. The irony was clear. The same order once accused of manipulating empires was now quietly shaping the birth of a new one. Even after the war ended, explorers in the early Republic relied on those ancient charts. Their markings guided Lewis and Clark through river valleys that no British map had ever shown. The Jesuits had recorded not conquest, but connection. And, though they were gone, their ink remained, a ghost map running beneath every boundary line drawn after independence. In the end, the revolution's greatest advantage may not have come from muskets or strategy, but from a faith that had measured the world long before it was divided by nations. Before the grand halls of Versailles glittered with ink and ceremony, the real negotiations happened in shadows, not in palaces, but in chapels, behind the smell of candle wax and old wood, where whispers could not be written down. It was there, in side rooms of monasteries and quiet convents across Paris and Madrid, that the church weighed its next move. The revolution in America was not just a colonial dispute, it was a shift in the balance of empires. France and Spain saw opportunity, but the Vatican saw danger and possibility woven together. A new world was forming, one that might either destroy faith or carry it into the future. So, years before any treaty was signed, a smaller, stranger one was being tested. It wasn't written on parchment. It was spoken, coded, and cloaked in language that could pass for prayer. The church called it prudence, but it was diplomacy disguised as devotion. Priests loyal to Rome met quietly with envoys loyal to the American cause. They spoke not of war but of mercy, not of politics but of protection. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If the American experiment could become a shield against Protestant Britain, perhaps rebellion could be forgiven in the name of divine strategy. Absolution for insurrection, if it created a world less hostile to Catholic souls. The Jesuit exiles played a role here too. Many had fled suppression and now worked as advisors in Europe's courts. Their knowledge of the colonies was unmatched. Some had taught the very men now leading the war across the Atlantic. They knew which bishops could be persuaded, which nobles would listen, and which coins could buy silence. Through their letters, the idea of a Catholic reconciliation began to circulate. The Vatican could not openly support rebellion, but it could quietly bless peace. Reports from those meetings describe scenes that feel almost cinematic. Franklin, in a French monastery garden, debating moral philosophy with a priest who had once preached against kings. A Spanish abbot passing a sealed note to an American courier under the guise of confession. Even rumours of a papal envoy, travelling incognito, assessing whether the colonies might one day accept a Catholic bishop on their soil. Nothing official, nothing provable, but everything pointed to an understanding that faith could adapt if the world demanded it. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the Vatican had already made its choice. It would not condemn the new nation. It would wait, watch, and if opportunity allowed, embrace it. The treaty before the treaty had done its work. It softened hearts, opened doors, and ensured that when Rome finally spoke, it would do so not as an enemy of liberty, but as its cautious ally. In the end, history recorded only the signatures of diplomats, but somewhere beneath those lines lingered another kind of agreement, one written in prayer, sealed in trust, and whispered in sanctuaries where the future of faith and freedom first shook hands. There are moments in history when time itself feels choreographed, when the sacred and the secular seem to march in step without ever meaning to. During the American Revolution, one of those strange rhythms emerged. Across the ocean, the bells of Rome called the faithful to prayer, while in Boston, drums beat the call to battle. And when historians later compared the dates, something eerie appeared. Feast days and battle days, miracles and massacres, victories and vespers, falling on the same days as if history itself was keeping time with two different metronomes that somehow shared a beat. On April 19th, 1775, the day the first shots rang out at Lexington, the Vatican celebrated the feast of St. Leo the Great, a pope remembered for standing against tyranny and defending the weak. 2 years later, the signing of the alliance between France and America fell on the feast of St. Scholastica, the patroness of learning and freedom of the soul. Even the surrender at Yorktown in 1781 landed near the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, the humble saint who renounced wealth to serve a higher cause. Coincidence, maybe. But as reports reached Europe, priests began to notice. Some wrote in their diaries that the alignment of battles and feast days was divine rhythm, a sign that the struggle across the Atlantic was not just political but providential. Others whispered that it was manipulation, that someone was guiding the calendar, blending faith and war in ways unseen. Franklin himself, ever the rationalist, remarked that the revolution's timing seemed favoured by a clock we do not wind. But behind that clever phrase lay an unsettling truth. In the 18th century, the church still controlled the rhythm of daily life. Bells rang not only for prayer, but for work, meals, and curfews. The cadence of faith shaped the cadence of nations, and when that rhythm carried across the sea, even unintentionally, it created patterns that felt like prophecy. The Continental Army often rested or regrouped on Sundays, giving rise to legends that divine timing shielded them. In Rome, papal scribes recorded major victories not by date but by feast, as if to fold the rebellion quietly into the story of saints. The overlap became impossible to ignore. Maps of battles and calendars of holy days began to look eerily alike, their intersections forming a hidden liturgy of revolution. Scholars, centuries later, found letters from French priests, noting how the bells of their cathedrals rang in harmony with colonial victories, the sound of faith echoing across time zones as if history were conducting a grand, unseen symphony. Perhaps it was just chance, or perhaps the old world and the new were connected by something deeper, a pulse that beat beneath both altar and battlefield. Whatever it was, those parallel calendars told a story the textbooks never could. That the revolution may not have been entirely human in its rhythm, but guided by a music older than kings, one that played in cathedrals and campgrounds alike. In the quiet corners of churches, from Paris to Philadelphia, revolutions were whispered long before they were declared, not in taverns or newspapers, but inside confessionals. Behind those wooden screens, where secrets met silence, priests became the first to hear the sound of change. Farmers confessed anger at taxes. Merchants spoke of smuggling. Soldiers murmured doubts about their kings. And though the church demanded silence, The confessor's ear became the most accurate weather vane of the age, turning with every gust of rebellion and royal exhaustion. By the 1770s, priests in Europe had begun to notice a shift. The sins of the people were changing. Pride was no longer about greed, but about defiance. Men no longer confessed envy of their betters, but frustration that those betters ruled unjustly. Even in Rome, where penance was supposed to wash away dissent, the rhythm of confession had taken on the tone of unrest. The priests could not speak of it publicly, but they wrote letters to their bishops, warning that faith itself was changing shape. One priest in Lyon noted that the people no longer kneel in fear, but in fatigue. In France, the Jesuit expulsion a few years earlier had already fractured the trust between church and crown. Now, as the American colonies burned with revolution, that fracture became a fault line. Reports from missionaries in the New World described colonists who prayed earnestly yet refused obedience to kings or bishops. To some priests, it felt like a heresy wrapped in patriotism. To others, it felt like prophecy. In America, Catholic clergy faced a different struggle. Many of their parishioners were torn between loyalty to Britain and loyalty to liberty. The confessional became their only safe space to wrestle with that choice. Priests like John Carroll heard the same question over and over again. Was rebellion a sin if the king no longer served God's justice? Carroll, careful and cautious, never gave a simple answer. Instead, he listened. In that silence, he learned what the pamphlets and public speeches could not say. The revolution was not just political, it was moral. It was about conscience and the right to think without fear. Across the ocean, papal advisors began collecting reports from confessors across Europe, trying to gauge how deeply this new spirit had spread. What they found frightened them. Even among nobles and soldiers, there was weariness with divine right and endless war. The Church's silence could no longer contain what the people were saying. Yet the Vatican, ever watchful, understood the danger of speaking too soon. Confessionals had become both mirrors and maps, reflecting a world ready to change and pointing toward a future where obedience would no longer be enough to keep faith alive. The priests kept their vows of silence, but their silence spoke louder than any sermon. It carried through cathedrals and colonies alike, an invisible pulse that told the world the old order was running out of breath and something new was beginning to rise. In the age of revolution, not all weapons were forged in iron. Some were hidden beneath rosaries and folded linens, carried in the names of mercy and charity. While muskets flashed in Boston and cannons thundered in Yorktown, another kind of supply line wound through Europe's cloisters and harbours, quiet and unseen. Convent doors that once sheltered orphans and the poor began receiving strange deliveries, crates marked as donations, sealed with wax, and signed by benefactors whose names never appeared in public records. Inside, there were no blankets or bandages, but gunpowder, shot, and musket parts. The Church had long mastered the art of discretion. Centuries of persecution and politics had taught it how to move unseen. And now, in the chaos of the 1770s, that skill was being used to keep an unholy secret, one that linked the Vatican's cautious diplomacy to the American rebellion. In the port cities of France and Spain, mercy ships sailed under the banner of relief. Officially, they carried food, wine, and medicine for missions in the New World. Unofficially, their manifests were coded, their cargo carefully disguised. A convent in Bordeaux recorded in its ledger a shipment of candlesticks and linens sent to the Caribbean. The candles were musket barrels. The linens were gunpowder sacks wrapped tight. Even the silver used for chalices was quietly melted into coins to fund rebel armies. None of this was done openly, and few within the Church knew the full extent. But for those who did, it was justified as a kind of divine pragmatism. Helping a rebellion was dangerous, but helping souls seeking freedom was holy work, especially if it weakened old rivals who had long kept Catholic nations under Protestant shadow. The web of patronage grew deeper. French bishops, sympathetic to the American cause, arranged secret loans through abbeys. Spanish monasteries offered storage for contraband marked as religious goods. A few daring nuns even participated directly, tending wounded sailors who arrived in the night, whispering prayers as they packed crates that would one day arm men across an ocean. The irony was profound. The same church that had once condemned rebellion was now, in hidden corners, helping it survive. Perhaps not by command, but by quiet consent. No papal signature appeared on any manifest. No bishop dared write the word musket, but the rhythm of charity disguised the movement of war. When historians later examined the ledgers, they found patterns too neat to be coincidence. The same donors, the same routes, the same ships vanishing from one port, only to appear near colonial waters weeks later. Mercy and militancy had become one. And through it all, the Church maintained its silence, content to let its ships sail under the flag of compassion. Whether out of faith or foresight, the result was the same. A rebellion starving for powder and shot found both delivered in crates blessed for the poor. The convents prayed, the rebels fought, and history would remember only one of them, never realizing how the other had helped light the fuse. When the first American flag was raised, its design seemed simple enough. 13 stars, 13 stripes, a symbol of unity born from rebellion. But for those who knew the language of symbols, it was anything but simple. Across Europe, priests, scholars, and artists looked at that flag and saw something hauntingly familiar. The circle of stars was not a new idea. It had long been a sacred one. In churches from Rome to Paris, the Virgin Mary had been painted for centuries, wearing a crown of 12 stars, a sign of divine grace and protection. Now, in the New World, a flag waved bearing 13. The resemblance was too close to ignore. Some called it coincidence. Others whispered it was catechism in disguise. To the untrained eye, it was the emblem of a young republic. To those who studied the old iconography, it looked like an echo of the Queen of Heaven turned into a symbol of liberty. In the halls of the Vatican, the comparison sparked quiet debate. Could a Protestant-born rebellion unknowingly have chosen a Marian crown as its symbol? Or had the influence of Catholic minds shaped the design from the shadows? The question was never answered, but the parallels were uncanny. The stars arranged in a circle mirrored not only the halo of Mary, but also the order of constellations used in Jesuit astronomy, where heaven itself was seen as a divine clock. Even the choice of an eagle, as America's emblem, carried a hidden history. The eagle had long been the symbol of empires, but in Christian art, it represented resurrection, the soul rising toward light. To the revolutionaries, it meant freedom. To the Church, it meant transcendence. Somewhere between those meanings, a bridge formed. Historians later discovered that some of the early designers of the flag, including men close to Franklin, had been influenced by European heraldry and religious art. In Philadelphia's secret lodges and Parisian drawing rooms, discussions of symbols were more than decoration, they were doctrine, painted in metaphor. A flag was never just a flag, it was a prayer stitched in code. When the first copy of the flag reached Rome through diplomatic channels, it was noted by the archivists not as a political banner, but as a new celestial emblem of order. That phrase appeared once in a private Vatican report, then vanished from records altogether. Whether admiration or alarm, no one can say. Yet the idea lingered. A republic crowned not by kings but by stars. A nation founded not under a single church, yet guided by imagery born from one. The old world's sacred geometry had quietly become the new world's national language. Perhaps it was unintentional, perhaps it was instinct, but the pattern was clear. The revolution had not only changed politics, it had borrowed heaven's symbols to explain itself. The flag that flew over independence carried with it more than freedom. It carried centuries of faith transformed into a new mythology, where the virgin stars had become the Republic's sky, and the eagle soared between the two. In the summer of 1776, while drums rolled and declarations were signed, a quieter ceremony took place, far from the eyes of armies and assemblies. In a small chapel on the edge of Maryland, candlelight flickered across the stone walls as a handful of men gathered to witness an oath. No flags, no muskets, only whispers. At the centre stood John Carroll, a priest and cousin to Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. Between them hung a question no nation had ever answered before. Could liberty exist without destroying faith? And could faith survive without kneeling to kings? The world they had known said no. The church belonged to monarchs, and rebellion was sin. But the Carrolls believed otherwise. Their oath was not rebellion against the church, nor submission to any crown. It was a promise to build a country where conscience ruled freely, where the soul owed its allegiance to truth rather than throne. John Carroll's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the crucifix and spoke. His words were said to blend the language of the gospel with the language of revolution. Liberty without schism, Catholicity without crown. A prayer and a prophecy in one breath. The oath marked the birth of something radical. For centuries, Catholics in the colonies had lived as outcasts, distrusted by their Protestant neighbours and monitored by British governors who feared papal influence. Now, with the old world collapsing, the Carrolls saw a chance to prove that Catholic faith could thrive in a republic built on reason and equality. It was more than theology, it was survival. The Carroll oath became an unspoken pact between faith and freedom. The family would work to show that Catholics could be loyal to the new republic, and the republic, in turn, would have to learn that belief did not always breed tyranny. Charles would speak for liberty in the halls of power. John would speak for faith in the quiet of churches. Their balance held the tension of two worlds learning to coexist. Word of their vow spread quietly through the colonies. For Catholics long forced to hide their identity, it was a sign of hope. Even Protestant leaders began to notice. Washington himself would later praise John Carroll for his wisdom and moderation, calling him a man of both virtue and reason. Years later, when Rome finally recognized the United States and appointed John Carroll as the first bishop of the new nation, that oath was fulfilled. He wore no crown, demanded no empire, and yet commanded respect from all sides. In that chapel's silence, a new form of Catholicism had taken shape, one that would walk hand in hand with democracy rather than against it. The Carroll Oath remains unwritten in history books, yet its spirit endures in every place where belief and freedom learn to speak the same language. It was not just a promise between cousins, but a covenant between the past and the future. In the ruins of an old Jesuit college outside Quebec, long after the Revolution's echoes had faded, a worker found a leather-bound book buried beneath a collapsed floorboard. Its pages were thick with age, its ink faded to brown, but the title written on the inside cover was still clear: Registrum Nigrae Vestis, the Black Robe Ledger. It was not a prayer book or a theological text. It was a list. Names written in careful Latin script, grouped not by rank or order, but by skill. Scholars, surveyors, sailors, cartographers. Men who, according to church records, should have disappeared when the Society of Jesus was suppressed in 1773. Yet these same names began to appear years later in the strangest places, crossing paths with the Revolution at its most critical moments. One was found signed beneath a map of the Hudson River used by colonial officers. Another appeared in the payroll of a French ship that smuggled supplies into New England. A third, once listed as a Jesuit mathematician, was recorded as an engineer helping Washington cross the Delaware on a freezing Christmas night in 1776. Historians have long debated whether this ledger was coincidence or coordination, but to those who have studied it closely, it reads less like a record and more like a plan. Every name matched a moment when knowledge changed the course of battle. The Jesuits had always believed that intelligence, not might, shaped destiny. Even stripped of their order, they had not forgotten how to move unseen. The ledger seemed to show how their network quietly reassembled, not under papal seal but under necessity. Its pages included coded notations beside certain names. A cross for those in the colonies, a triangle for those still in Europe, a circle for those who could travel freely between both worlds. The handwriting suggested multiple authors, men still loyal to the old discipline of the black robes, even if they now served under different flags. Some of the entries included strange symbols beside their professions, markings that looked more like navigation formulas than religious signs. When the ledger reached historians in the 19th century, it was dismissed as an artifact of conspiracy, a curiosity rather than evidence. Yet the connections refused to vanish. Letters from Franklin mentioned anonymous engineers fluent in Latin. French generals thanked unnamed clerks who provided accurate maps of territories never formally surveyed. And always the same pattern returned. Knowledge appeared exactly when it was needed most, as if guided by invisible hands. Perhaps the Jesuits had simply continued doing what they always had, teaching, guiding, recording, or perhaps the Black Robe Ledger was their quiet rebellion, proof that even when silenced, their minds could still shape the world. The ledger now rests in a private collection, its pages fragile, but its mystery alive. Each name is a story of loyalty without recognition, faith without orders, service without glory. In the end, it stands as a testament to how the revolution's greatest weapon may not have been firepower or fortune, but the forgotten wisdom of men who refused to let knowledge die. No papal banners flew over American soil during the revolution. No legions marched beneath the Vatican crest. Yet somehow, Rome's influence crossed the ocean all the same. It did not arrive with soldiers or saints, but through letters, introductions, and dispensations written in a language older than diplomacy itself. They called it charity, counsel, or friendship, but it was really something else. It was strategy, dressed in grace. In the chaos of the 1770s, when empires cracked and alliances shifted, the Church moved as it always had, quietly. Rome did not choose sides, it softened them. Through secret correspondences passed between abbots, bishops, and scholars, subtle guidance made its way into the hands of men shaping the future. A single recommendation from a priest in Paris could open a door in Madrid. A note from a Jesuit exile could secure a meeting between Franklin and a noble family with deep Vatican ties. Every act seemed small, almost invisible, but together they formed a web of influence that touched both altar and army. The British viewed Catholicism with suspicion, fearing papal meddling in colonial affairs. Yet, as the war dragged on, that fear began to fade. The tone of sermons changed. Accusations of popish plots softened. The shift was no accident. It was the result of quiet intervention, of papal diplomats whispering reason into the ears of bishops and ambassadors across Europe. They reminded them that stability, not victory, was the Church's greatest ally. So when the colonies sought legitimacy abroad, Rome's invisible hand was already smoothing the way. Dispensations were granted for marriages between Protestant leaders and Catholic sympathizers, creating social bridges where political ones could not exist. Jesuit scholars, once scattered by suppression, served as interpreters and mediators in European courts, crafting letters that read like theological essays but carried political meaning hidden between the lines. One such letter, preserved in a Roman archive, speaks of a people without king, yet seeking order, a clear reference to the American cause. The Vatican could not publicly endorse rebellion, but neither could it ignore the moral force of a nation declaring liberty in the language of divine rights. Through intermediaries, Rome made introductions between sympathetic financiers and colonial envoys, men who provided money under the pretense of trade, but with blessings that came from higher authority. Even the French clergy, once wary of revolution, began to see the Americans as potential partners in preserving faith without monarchy. The influence of these efforts cannot be measured in battles or treaties, but in tone. A rebellion once condemned as chaos began to sound like destiny. By the time independence was won, the Vatican had lost no soldiers, spent no treasure, yet gained what it valued most: influence over the conscience of a new world. Rome had extended its hand across the sea without ever being seen, guiding the storm not by force but by faith. And when the noise of war faded, that invisible hand remained, resting quietly behind the idea that freedom and faith might not be enemies after all. In the busy port of Bordeaux, the smell of Sultan wine mixed with incense from the churches that lined the waterfront. Sailors crossed themselves before boarding ships, merchants whispered prayers over contracts, and priests walked the docks blessing barrels marked for the new world. To anyone watching, it looked like business as usual. But beneath the hymns and the hum of trade, another rhythm moved. Barrels and benedictions travelled together, carrying more than spirits and grain. The revolution needed supplies, and France was under embargo. Officially, no cargo bound for the American colonies could leave port. Unofficially, Bordeaux became the hinge that turned the tide of war. Behind its taverns and counting houses, a network of Catholic merchants operated under the quiet protection of sympathetic clergy. Their ships sailed under false manifests, but their missions were blessed all the same. They called themselves the Brotherhood of St. Nicholas, patron of sailors. In truth, they were financiers, smugglers, and patriots disguised as pious traders. Their ledgers spoke of charitable shipments and relief donations, phrases that hid the truth, that these goods were destined for American regiments starving for powder, salt, and steel. The Church's role in all this was never written but always felt. Abbots offered prayers for the safe passage of ships, often handing captains small medals of saints said to protect travellers and keep secrets. Some of those medals, when examined later, contained tiny slips of parchment rolled inside, messages in Latin naming ports, and contacts on the other side of the Atlantic. It was faith repurposed as encryption. The merchants understood the power of appearances. They attended Mass before every voyage, knowing that confession and communion made the perfect cover for conspiracy. One priest in Bordeaux, Father Lambert, became known as the sailor's confessor. He blessed ships with water drawn from the Garonne and said to carry the reflection of every star that guided the way to America. Few knew that Lambert also managed the correspondence between French financiers and American agents, ensuring that money, messages, and miracles all left port together. The barrels marked for mission aid contained gunpowder hidden beneath sacks of flour, rolls of cloth for church vestments, concealed musket flints, and medical supplies. When the ships returned, they carried tobacco, indigo, and news of victories that priests repeated in sermons, disguised as parables. Even after the war, rumours persisted that the Vatican knew of this operation and chose not to interfere. Whether out of political restraint or quiet approval, no one can say. But the archives of Bordeaux tell their own story. In one ledger preserved from 1779, beside a list of charitable exports, someone had drawn a small cross next to the word liberty. The handwriting belonged not to a merchant, but to a monk. It was a signature of faith in motion, proof that in an age of war and embargo, belief and bravery shared the same ships. Bordeaux became more than a port. It was a pulpit on the water, preaching revolution beneath the sign of the cross. When the smoke cleared at Yorktown in the autumn of 1781, the sound that followed was not the cheer of soldiers, but the deep, echoing voices of hymns. The war that had begun with musket fire ended with music, and the first song to rise was not a ballad of victory, but a prayer. The Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving older than any empire, was sung in chapels from Maryland to Paris. Bells rang in rhythm with the Atlantic tide, carrying a single message across two worlds, that a nation had been born, and that faith, in its quiet endurance, had been there to witness it. In Maryland, where Catholics had lived for generations beneath suspicion, churches opened their doors wide for the first time. Candles burned through the night as parishioners wept in gratitude, not only for freedom from kings, but for the promise of worship without fear. Priests who had hidden their vestments during the early years of rebellion now wore them proudly, standing before altars that no longer bowed to crowns. John Carroll, the Jesuit priest, who had once wondered if Rome would ever recognize this new republic, led a solemn mass of thanksgiving. He spoke softly of courage and mercy, of a God who had guided the storm but asked nothing in return. His words carried through the crowd and settled like light on the faces of farmers, sailors, and soldiers. For them, this victory was more than politics. It was redemption. Across the ocean, in Paris, the chapels filled with diplomats and soldiers who had watched the revolution from afar. Even in Rome, where official silence had long been policy, the bells of St. Peter's rang for peace. The Vatican would never say it had favoured rebellion, yet its cathedrals joined the chorus of thanksgiving. In that moment, faith and freedom stood side by side, no longer rivals but companions in a fragile new world. The smell of incense mixed with the salt of the sea carried on ships sailing home with the news. It was said that sailors wept as they heard the hymn through open church doors, a song they had once sung only for the dead now offered to the living. The battlefield at Yorktown became sacred ground, not because of blood, but because of gratitude. Soldiers built small wooden crosses from broken rifles and planted them in the dirt as makeshift altars. The war had been fought with steel, but peace arrived with prayer. The Te Deum echoed through the corridors of power, through the streets of cities still scarred by fire, and into the hearts of those who had lost everything but faith. It was a sound that told the world the revolution had ended, but belief had not. The hymn faded, but its meaning did not. The new nation, fragile and uncertain, bowed its head toward the old altars it had once feared, and in that gesture, the past and future finally met, not as enemies, but as one voice rising to heaven. In the years after the revolution, when the muskets had cooled and the ink of independence had dried, a quieter battle began. It was not fought on fields or in courts, but in chapels. The question now was not how to build a nation, but how to guide its soul. For the first time in history, the Church found itself in a land with no crown, no throne, and no king to mediate between God and government. The old order of Christendom, where bishops answered to monarchs, had no place here. America was an experiment in liberty, and Rome faced a dilemma it had never known. Could a bishop serve both God and a republic born from rebellion? The answer came in the form of John Carroll, the same Jesuit who once took his oath in a Maryland chapel, promising liberty without schism and faith without crown. Chosen not by royal decree, but by the vote of his peers, Carroll became the first bishop of the United States in 1789. His appointment was more than a title, it was a declaration. A church without throne, a state without scepter. The idea shocked Europe. Never before had the Vatican allowed a bishop to be selected by local clergy rather than kings or emperors. Yet the times demanded it. The world was changing, and Rome, cautious but wise, chose to change with it. Carroll's task was immense. He had to build a church in a nation that distrusted churches, to preach obedience without submission, and to teach that faith could flourish under freedom. From his home in Baltimore, he worked tirelessly to organize parishes, educate priests, and establish schools that would blend enlightenment with devotion. He understood that in this new world, religion could not rule by fear. It had to persuade by reason. The Constitution had promised freedom of worship, and Carroll saw in that promise not a threat, but a gift. For the first time, faith would not be enforced by law, but chosen by the heart. Rome watched carefully. Some cardinals doubted, fearing that independence from monarchs would lead to independence from the church itself. But Carroll's success silenced them. His letters to the Vatican spoke of unity, loyalty, and humility. He never sought power, only peace between conscience and country. And when he celebrated the first public mass for the United States, his prayer carried the spirit of both citizen and shepherd, a flock beyond the reach of kings, guided not by crown or sword, but by belief in something higher than both. The world took notice. Even Washington praised him, calling him a man who made religion a friend to liberty. In that moment, the great divide between Rome and revolution began to close. The Church had found its place in a republic, and the republic had found its soul in a bishop, who proved that freedom and faith could share the same altar without fear. History is written by survivors, but edited by the comfortable. After the revolution ended, and the new republic found its footing, the story of how it began to change. Official histories smoothed rough edges, trimmed inconvenient truths, and polished away the strange alliances that had made victory possible. Somewhere between the classroom and the cathedral, memory itself became a negotiation. The papal seals that once appeared in private letters vanished from the archives. The names of priests, merchants, and Jesuit exiles who had quietly shaped events were replaced by generals and statesmen. Even the documents that survived began to blur. In some, ink faded naturally with time. In others, words were deliberately erased, as if the parchment itself was ashamed of what it had once confessed. The Vatican's correspondence with American envoys was reduced to polite summaries. The French records of charitable shipments were reclassified as trade. The convent ledgers that had hidden weapons were locked away, labelled as irrelevant devotional material. The Revolution, once a symphony of faith and rebellion, was rewritten as a secular anthem. The Church's shadow withdrew from the page, leaving behind only a faint outline. What remained were absences shaped like answers. Historians call them gaps, but sometimes the gaps say more than the words ever could. It was as if the world had agreed to forget that faith and freedom had ever been allies. To remember would mean to admit that the Vatican, for all its caution, had danced with the very forces it once condemned. It was easier to bury the evidence beneath layers of patriotism and progress. Yet, in rare collections and forgotten corners of libraries, fragments still surface. A seal half broken on a letter written in 1779, a diary from a French abbot describing meetings with American agents, a note from John Carroll thanking friends in Europe for unseen generosity. Each discovery feels like the echo of a larger truth, a story that refused to stay erased. The silence that followed the revolution was not born of ignorance, but of intention. The world needed heroes, not complications. And so, the priests who prayed for the rebels, the monks who shipped powder beneath linens, the bishops who risked their standing for the sake of conscience, all disappeared into footnotes too faint to follow. Yet the evidence remains in the tone of the new republic itself, in its tolerance for belief, in its insistence that conscience is sacred. One can still hear the whisper of Rome's influence. The Articles of Amnesia, though never written, became the unspoken treaty between history and truth. Forget enough to keep the peace, remember just enough to keep the mystery alive. What we now call independence was not the work of men alone. It was also the quiet victory of those who knew that every revolution must eventually choose what it remembers and what it hides. Deep beneath the streets of Rome lies a vault that few have ever seen. It has no windows, no clock, and no name carved on its door. Scholars call it the Archivum, but most simply refer to it as the Vatican Archives. To the public, it is said to hold centuries of letters, decrees, and relics of empire. But to those who have tried to enter, it feels alive. The air hums like breath against stone, and the walls seem to listen. Every request for access is answered with a phrase that sounds like confession. Denied, mislabeled, private, as if the past itself were refusing to be seen. They say it stretches for miles, that its shelves hold more pages than any library on earth. Each box is a heartbeat of history, numbered but never explained. Some boxes are listed, others simply disappear. In the ledgers that record what is stored, entire entries end with a single word, removed. Historians who search for connections between the Vatican and the American Revolution often find their requests redirected or delayed. Documents dated 1776 to 1783 seem to vanish into administrative silence. Those who do gain access describe a strange order. Corridors labelled in Latin, guards who speak little, and lights that flicker as if reacting to the weight of the words they protect. One scholar once claimed to have seen a box marked with an unfamiliar seal, a sun and a cross intertwined. Inside, he said, were letters written in both French and English, addressed not to cardinals, but to men who signed the Declaration of Independence. When he returned the next morning, the box was gone. No record of it remained. The archivum is not just a collection of history, it is a living machine of memory. It decides what survives and what sleeps. Every generation adds new locks and new rules. Even the digital age has not broken its silence. When archivists are asked about certain topics, their responses are precise but empty. There is no file under that name. There is no record for that date. There is no document matching that description. It is the archive that doesn't exist, yet it holds the stories that shaped nations. Priests whisper that some records are not missing, but hidden for the sake of faith. Others believe the Church guards them because their contents might reveal how deeply it once moved in the shadows of history. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. The Vatican has always understood that mystery is its own form of power. To know everything is to lose reverence. To hide something is to make it eternal. The archivum breathes like an organ, each note released only for those patient enough to wait. Somewhere in its endless corridors, among dust and parchment, the missing pages of the American Revolution may still rest, waiting, silent and perfectly preserved, as if the past itself is holding its breath, unwilling to let go of the secrets that gave birth to a nation. In the years after the war, when the echo of cannon fire faded into the rhythm of ordinary life, two symbols remained at the heart of the New World, the compass and the key. One guided explorers through uncharted land, the other guarded doors that few would ever open. Together, they became emblems of a quiet understanding between a nation and a church that had once watched each other from opposite sides of faith and power. The compass belonged to the Republic, always pointing toward progress, discovery, and freedom. The key belonged to Rome, turning slowly in locks of tradition and mystery. Neither could move without the other. For though the revolution had declared liberty from crowns and altars, it could not escape the language of belief. Every principle it claimed, equality, conscience, virtue, echoed ideas older than any constitution. The Church knew this, and so did the statesmen who had built the Republic. In the darkness of chapels and the light of assemblies, they had all felt the same truth, that revolutions, no matter how loud, are born from silence, from reflection, from prayer. When George Washington knelt in the snow at Valley Forge, his prayer was not to empire, but to providence. When John Carroll wrote to Rome after independence, his words spoke of a nation guided by both faith and reason. And when the Vatican finally acknowledged the United States in 1789, it did so without trumpets or decrees, only a letter, a gesture of peace, the compass and the key turning in the same moment. The Church had learned that it could exist without kings. The Republic had learned that freedom without morality collapses into chaos. Between them, a fragile harmony formed, one that still hums beneath the noise of politics and progress. The old cathedrals of Europe stood firm, but across the Atlantic, new chapels rose beside courthouses, symbols of a balance no one had expected to last but somehow did. Each side gave the other what it lacked. The Church offered patience, the nation offered purpose, and though both stumbled, they shared the same human hope, that truth could be found not only in books or laws, but in the spaces between them. Today, the Vatican's archives still hold their secrets, and America still guards its myths. Yet between the two, there lingers that same invisible thread, woven during the Revolution and never fully severed. Some call it coincidence, others providence. Perhaps it is both. The compass keeps turning, seeking what is next. The key remains, guarding what was. And somewhere between movement and memory, light and shadow, faith and freedom continue their quiet dance. For every nation needs direction, and every faith needs mystery. And sometimes, the greatest revolutions are not the ones fought with muskets, but the ones kept alive by candles burning in silence, guiding the way for those who dare to look beyond the map and listen for the key that still turns in the heart of history.